Hi there, I'm Mark Tops, and this is the foundational series of video interviews with industry experts providing you with the fundamentals you'll need for running a care business. What happens now? Does somebody shout action? And action! In this episode, we're going to be talking all things inspections, an overview of key changes to CQC regulations and practices, as well as tried and tested ways to help you prepare for inspection. Joining me is Karen Ritson, founder of Outstanding Care Consultancy. Karen has 15 years of experience working for the CQC as an inspector, but also played a key role in developing the guidance that inspectors use to reach a judgment about the ratings they award. Let's see how a combination of technology and teamwork can help deliver a successful result every time. Hi Karen, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Are you able just to describe the CQC and the role that they play in domiciliary care?
CQC is the independent regulator of health and social care in England. It's a different inspectorate in Scotland and Wales. And as far as domiciliary care is concerned, CQC will register domiciliary care usually for the regulated activity of personal care. So domiciliary care providers don't register for accommodation, that's for care homes. And they, CQC monitor, they inspect, they provide a report, and a rating for the service. But they also respond to concerns. So sometimes they might close the service down, or they might put restrictions on the registration if there are concerns. So overall, it's a monitoring and inspection role.
Thank you very much. And there's obviously been a number of changes over the last few weeks, the last few months, with the rollout of the single assessment framework. Are you able just to give us a quick overview of what those key changes are?
Well, yes, the CQC are rolling out the single assessment framework at the moment, which means they're inspecting and they're rating to in a slightly different way. So they're starting in the south of the country and they're gradually moving further north. So they've already started in the south, and they're hoping to be inspecting to the new way, I think towards the end of March for all services. But actually, the regulations haven't really changed. So that's quite a reassuring thing, I think, in a way, that everything comes back to the regulations. There's an amendment to Regulation 18 about services caring for autistic people, about training, but actually, other than that, the regulations are more or less the same. But the new way of inspecting will see CQC gathering more information from services, visiting for less time or possibly not at all in some cases. They'll be changing ratings not only as a result of visiting the site and inspecting, but in response to information they might receive at other times as well. And they'll be looking for more information from people who are using the service, from people in the community, from staff, from other professionals, to inform the whole inspection process. And they might speak with other bodies like Health Watch as well, which is what they've done before. So they'll be inspecting to the new quality statements, but those will be under the same 5 key questions that we're all familiar with: safe, effective, caring, responsive and well-led. So they'll be gathering evidence under 6 evidence categories, and a lot of that evidence is around feedback. So there's a shift in emphasis towards feedback from people. And then they'll rate services and they'll aggregate the ratings so that they get an overall rating for the service, and they'll rate each individual key question like they used to. So although there are changes, there are some things that are remaining the same or similar. So it's not a complete upheaval, which I think is quite, that's quite a reassuring thing for people when they're thinking about the new way of inspection.
No, thank you very much. And I'm really pleased you said there that actually the actual regulations aren't changing, it's just the framework itself. Is there any part of the framework that you think will impact domiciliary care providers more so than any of the other parts?
Possibly. I think that's a possibility, actually. The home care services, they might get shorter visits. I think care homes may get shorter visits as well. Occasionally, they might not get visited at all. And CQC will be asking for documents to be sent to them in a way that they didn't used to so much. So they'll be relying more on that. Staff will receive telephone calls to give their views. And also there'll be phone calls to key professionals and other people involved in the service. And as usual, they'll be using CQC will be using the provider information return form. So I think the big difference will be in the length of the visit, and occasionally they might notice that they don't get visited at all. So that, I think, for home care is the big difference.
And in terms of during the actual inspection, so we know there's going to be a lot of data collection in the background. During the actual inspection, what can care providers expect to see?
When CQC actually come and visit, they'll be looking at all the things that they looked at before. They might be asking for documents such as care plans to be sent through to them. They'll be looking for evidence of partnership working, that sort of thing, with professionals, evidence of clinical care, good evidence about gathering consent and considering capacity, that sort of thing. So there's the range of documents are very similar to the range of documents you'd be expecting to provide at site visits now, but some of that will be provided electronically or scanned and sent through to CQC. One of the things I think is probably important to do is to prepare your staff for CQC questions about things like care planning and abuse awareness and person-centered care planning and their relationship with management, things like that, how they work with professionals, and to prepare staff for being able to give some success stories about the work that they're doing currently with the people that they support, so that CQC get an idea of some case studies that they might like to showcase in the reports that they write. It's also important to think about governance and audit and analysis of audit results. And CQC may ask for that information to be sent, or they may come on site and ask for that information as well. So until I think the way of inspecting becomes embedded, it might be a combination of different things that happen actually at the site visit or that happen in the provision of information to CQC.
Thank you. And I love the examples that you just gave there. Are there any other ways, drawing on your experience as an inspector, and obviously now in the work you do consulting, of any tried and tested ways during inspections that seem to work better than others?
One of the things, if you're a small domiciliary care business, is to remind yourself that actually, often if you're the registered manager, you're doing all sorts of different roles, and bigger organisations will have separate members of staff for that. So it's very possible that you might be the registered manager, but you might also be the scheduler, you might be the recruiter, you might be the person that's going out and doing the assessing and drawing up the care plans, doing the risk assessments, a whole range of different things. That all come under one heading of your role until you expand and can take on those different people that will do those different roles. So I think it's important to remember that you need to provide evidence under all of those different things. So things like recruitment and the evidence around staffing and supervision, you're providing evidence of that alongside care planning and training and audit. All those things are equally important, really. So I think for small domiciliary care providers, if you have any senior staff, it's important to get your head together with those people, because it's quite a daunting thing to do completely on your own. And I will often find that the registered managers in domiciliary care organisations feel that they need to take on the whole of that responsibility themselves, when they do actually have even if it's a small team, they do have other people they can get together and bounce ideas off. So I think that if you can have a team approach, that really helps, even if your team's really small, and that you think about all the areas CQC are going to be asking for information for. And recognise that your role is going to encompass all of those.
Thank you very much. And I love how you said about utilising the team that you've got around you, and actually it's not just on the registered manager.
Yeah.
You touched there on some of the documentation. Is there any key documentation that domiciliary care providers should be capturing and making sure they've got ready for those inspections?
There's quite a lot. I think if I focus on some of the main ones, say, for example, if I'm doing a mock inspection with a service, I'll often send through a list of documents that I would like to see in advance. And I'm always surprised at what a huge range of documents I actually end up looking at when I'm doing that. But I won't go into all of those, but broadly speaking, safeguarding information. So know where your safeguarding referrals are so that you can provide that evidence. Medication, you might have some sample MARs, some sample audits, infection control audits, training records, information on staff recruitment, and then how we support staff through supervision. Some good examples of your care plans, risk assessments, that sort of thing. Some records about things like your involvement with court of protection authorisations. So any referrals and records that you've got about that. Accidents and incidents and any analysis of data around that is a really helpful thing to have. Any surveys or any results of surveys that you've carried out, review records, any complaint records, evidence of any kind of involvement that you've supported people to have in the community, or for them to follow their interests, or to have any social contact. All of that kind of information is really helpful under the responsive key question, and it's often something that services perhaps think is a bit of an afterthought because it's just something that they do. So I think it's really helpful to gather some evidence around those kind of things, and also to any case studies or evidence of what you consider to be outstanding practice is really helpful as well. So that's a really brief version of the kind of list that I would send out to people. But I think that covers some of the key points, Mark.
Just reminded us there of how much documentation there really is that's going on within domiciliary care businesses. Are there any pitfalls for domiciliary care providers to avoid?
I think in preparing for inspections, one of the things that I find that domiciliary care providers sometimes might find difficult, or will be a little bit of a pitfall, is about really not being proactive enough. So I think if you're thinking about getting your evidence ready, it's much easier than being reactive. And I think when people are providing a really good service, but they don't get a good rating, or they don't have a good experience of inspection, it's often because they felt a bit complacent, or they've felt, well, we know that we're giving people a really good service, and so we're just going to rely on that to get us through. And I think you need to be proactive, and you need to get that information ready, and to recognise that that's a separate sort of task in itself. I think when services don't understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, and if they're not prepared for what they're going to say about some areas that are not perhaps as strong as others. So say, for example, you might be aware that your staff supervisions, you're behind with them. If you can say, well, I'm behind with them, but this is my plan that I've got, so that I can tell you when we're going to get those up to date. It's quite a reassuring thing for CQC to see that you recognised it, you've got a plan in place, you know what you're going to do to put those things right. It's much more likely to result in a higher rating than if you just say, well, actually, we're really behind in our supervisions, and then you don't say anything else as a result of that. You really need to have a well-developed audit system. I think if you don't have information yourself about how your service is performing, you don't sound as confident, and you don't sound as competent when you're talking to CQC. And another thing I think is if you're not sure about some areas, or you have some weaknesses, it's not a great idea to be defensive or evasive, or just try and lead CQC off on the wrong track. Because I think that what happens then is that CQC dig further in that area, and it makes them focus often on your worst practice rather than your best practice. So it changes the focus of what they're looking at. And it makes them dig further into the areas that actually might be your weaknesses. And you then lose the opportunity to show CQC what your best practice is. So I think some of those things are, I think, perhaps really helpful to just to be better prepared, and to recognise that being prepared is a job in itself.
Absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head there with the inspectors. Actually, there might be things that crop up that are out of your control, but actually it's a learning curve, and it's how you can embed that practice to move the service forward.
Yeah.
With so much data that we're capturing in domiciliary care, are there any technology or services that you know of that can help you capture that all in one place? And what are the benefits of having it in one place?
I think I mean, I've worked with a range of different technology providers, and some are better than others. But I think that care planning software is really helpful. I think that's can be really useful in particularly in accessibility for staff, so they can really quickly see if you've updated a care plan. And that might be that the medication's changed, you've had a review with a GP, you can put that on the care plan and staff can see that before their first, the next call that they make to somebody. So it's that responsiveness that I think is really helpful for having care planning technology where you would have digital care planning. And I think that scheduling and rotoring is quite helpful to have online as well. So technology around that where, again, you can manipulate data really quickly. You can have spreadsheets. You can see how that all works. And I think perhaps staff recruitment and induction and training and supervision, so that you can manage the data, you can produce spreadsheets, you can see who is not quite up to date with their training. You can have a training matrix that's more easily, it's easier to check when people are not quite up to date. So it just helps with your whole management of information and making sure that your compliance is up to date. So I'd say those three kind of functions are perhaps the most helpful that you can use technology with for domiciliary care.
We spoke earlier about sometimes in inspections, things don't quite go to plan, they don't go how we want. We've now got our inspection report and there's some actions that we need to address, some things where we did fall short. What are some tips that you've got for where domiciliary care providers can start? Because I think sometimes it's overwhelming, isn't it? When you've got those actions, there isn't necessarily any forms or any guides that you can turn to have the answer. What would your advice be?
I think the first thing to do is to take a breath and don't panic, because often when you get the report through and there are a few things on there that aren't perhaps the best thing, it can be really dispiriting, can't it? It can really make you feel, we've worked so hard, but actually we haven't got a good outcome. Be clear then on who's accountable for what improvements you're going to make. So don't try and do it all yourself. Delegate tasks out to people who have a specialist interest in certain areas, or who has a role for doing that kind of thing. And make sure the actions are specific, and so that you know when you've achieved them. So don't, for example, going back to my earlier sort of point about being perhaps a bit behind with supervisions, don't make your action point that you're just going to get supervisions done. I would say, I'll get 3 of them done a week, so that you know that by this time next month you'll have completed 12 of them. And if you haven't, you've fallen short of that. If you have a vague goal, it's really unhelpful because you don't know when you've achieved it. Preparing for a CQC inspection is not the same as providing a really great service. The two things are separate, and I think if you get in a mindset of thinking it's a separate job, what I'm doing here, I'm preparing for my CQC inspection, it's got different skills, I need to put time aside for doing that, it's a separate job. I think that's a really important thing to get into your mind. And then when you put the time aside to do that preparation work, it's a really helpful approach to have. I think you need to check through the quality statements. I think if you're a new provider, actually this is going to be helpful because you're not encumbered with the old way of inspecting, so you're not having to forget a load of stuff and remember new stuff. When you're starting from scratch, it's easier, isn't it? So check through the quality statements, recognize that they're at a really high level, because the quality statements are actually exactly the same whether you're running a domiciliary care organisation, whether you've got a nursing home or a care home, whether you're running a hospital or a dentist surgery. So actually, they have to be vague because they encompass a whole different range of services. So think about how the quality statements impact your particular service, and be really clear about what you think the evidence is that you need to provide, and get it ready in advance. So, get your care files ready, get your case studies ready, get your audit results ready, analyse your audits, think about patterns and trends, have some ideas about learning that you've achieved as a result of analysing your data. be ready to show that you're proactive and that you've done a lot of this work yourself. And if you've done a lot of that work yourself, you've actually done quite a lot of the work for CQC, because that's what they're looking for. They're looking for those kind of results, so that they can just slot them straight into their inspection reports. So if you've done some of the work for them, I mean, it really stands to reason that it's going to be easier for them to give you that really good rating. And even, they might think, well, we've got such fantastic case studies here. We're really thinking we've got some information here where we might put forward an outstanding rating for this service. And it is achievable on your first inspection. So don't think that, that you don't need to aim high. You can aim high for your first inspection.
Thank you very much. The only thing from me is thank you very much for joining me. And as always, I take away so many tips and knowledge bites there from you. So thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic, Mark. It's been great to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it.